I called a plumber to fix a leak in the basement, and while he was working, I went to the market. About 10 minutes after I left, he called me, trembling. "Ma'am, who's down here with me?" I told him that no one else was home, but before he could respond, the call disconnected. I panicked when I got home and saw what had happened. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The autumn morning arrived with that peculiar Illinois chill that settles into your bones, the kind that makes you grateful for thick sweaters and hot coffee. I stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd raised 3 children and buried 1 husband, watching the old pipes beneath the sink drip their steady rhythm into the bucket I'd placed there 2 days prior. At 67 years old, I'd learned that some problems announce themselves quietly before they demand attention. I've lived in this farmhouse for 43 years, ever since Thomas brought me here as a young bride. "The house has good bones," he used to say. Running his carpenter's hands along the door frames, he'd reinforced himself. Good bones, but aging joints, just like us. The leak had started small, almost apologetic in its persistence. But by Tuesday morning, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The dampness had begun creeping up the basement walls, and I could smell that distinct mineral scent of water where it shouldn't be. My son Scott had been too busy to come by, always too busy these days, ever since he married Vanessa, and my daughter Claire lived 3 states away with her own family to tend. So I did what any sensible woman would do. I called Murphy's Plumbing, the same company that had been serving Millbrook since before my children were born. The plumber arrived at 9:30 sharp. His name was Ray Castillo, a young man in his early 30s with kind eyes and calloused hands that reminded me of Thomas. He had that respectful demeanor that's becoming increasingly rare, calling me ma'am and wiping his boots thoroughly before entering. "The shutoff valve is in the basement," I told him, leading him to the door that opened onto the narrow wooden stairs. "I'm afraid the lighting down there isn't what it used to be. Thomas kept meaning to update it, but—" I paused, the way I always did when Thomas's name slipped into present tense out of habit. "Well, there's a pull-chain lamp at the bottom of the stairs and another near the water heater." Ray nodded, collecting his toolbox and a large flashlight. "I'll take a good look around, Mrs. Allen. These old houses sometimes have issues that spread from one system to another. Might be more than just the kitchen connection." "Take your time," I said. "I need to run to the market anyway. We're supposed to get rain tonight, and I want to pick up a few things before the roads get slick. Will you be all right down there alone?" He smiled. "I work alone most days, ma'am. I'll be just fine." I gathered my purse and shopping list, threw on my wool coat, and headed out to my old Buick. The drive to Hendrickson's Market took 12 minutes on a good day, 15 if the traffic light at Main and Oakwood caught you wrong. It was a beautiful morning, despite the chill, the kind of day that makes you grateful to be alive and able to appreciate it. I was examining apples in the produce section, Honeycrisps, my favorite, when my cell phone rang. The screen showed Ray's number. "Hello? Mrs. Allen?" His voice sounded wrong, thin, strained, like someone trying to speak normally while their throat was closing. "Mrs. Allen, I need to ask you something." "What's wrong? Did you find the problem?" "Ma'am, who else is in this house?" The question came out rushed, almost whispered. "Who's down here with me?" My hand tightened around the phone. "What do you mean? There's nobody else home. The house is empty except for you." A pause. In that silence, I could hear something in the background, a sound I couldn't quite identify. A shuffling, perhaps. Or breathing. "Ray? Mrs. Allen, I'm not—" His voice cracked. "There's someone down here. I can hear them. I saw—" Then nothing. "Ray? Ray? Can you hear me?" The call had dropped. My heart hammered against my ribs with a force I hadn't felt in years. I stared at my phone, at the black screen that had just severed my connection to a frightened young man alone in my basement. Around me, other shoppers continued their mundane routines, comparing prices and checking their lists, completely unaware that my entire world had just tilted sideways. I tried calling back immediately. It went straight to voicemail. The market, the apples, my careful list. All of it became irrelevant. I abandoned my cart in the middle of the produce section and hurried to my car with a speed that made my knees protest. The drive home stretched into an eternity, each red light a personal insult, each slow-moving vehicle ahead of me a deliberate obstruction. What had Ray seen? Or heard? And why had the call dropped so suddenly? The rational part of my mind, the part that had raised children through fevers and fears, that had managed a household budget through lean years, that had nursed a dying husband with steady hands, tried to construct reasonable explanations. Perhaps he'd been startled by the old furnace kicking on. The house was full of sounds, especially in the basement where the water heater groaned and the ancient pipes sang their metallic songs. Maybe his phone battery had died. Maybe he'd simply lost signal in the basement's depths. But that voice, that trembling, genuine fear in his voice. I pulled into my driveway at exactly 10:47 a.m., according to the dashboard clock. Ray's van still sat in its spot, but something about the scene struck me as profoundly wrong. The front door stood slightly ajar. I always locked my doors. Always. It was a habit ingrained by 4 decades of living alone after the children moved out, reinforced by widowhood. Even with Ray inside, I would have locked it behind me. I sat in my car for a long moment, engine cooling with metallic ticks, staring at that half-open door. The sensible thing would be to call the police. The sensible thing would be to wait, to not enter my own home until someone official could determine it was safe. But this was my house. These were my walls, my floors, my memories embedded in every corner, and a young man might be in trouble inside. I took my phone and got out of the car. "Ray?" I called from the porch, pushing the door wider. "Ray, are you all right?" The house answered with silence. The kitchen looked exactly as I'd left it, bucket still under the sink, my morning coffee cup still on the counter. The basement door, however, stood open. I approached it slowly, each step deliberate. "Ray?" I peered down the stairs. The pull-chain lamp at the bottom was on, casting its weak yellow glow across concrete and shadows. But I couldn't see much beyond the first few steps. "Ray, it's Mrs. Allen. I'm back. Are you down there?" Still nothing. Every instinct screamed at me to back away, to call for help, to not descend those stairs. But what if he was hurt? What if he'd fallen, or had a heart attack? Or... I started down, one hand gripping the rail Thomas had installed 30 years ago, the other holding my phone with 911 ready to dial. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, announcing my presence to whatever waited below. The basement spread out before me in its familiar disarray. Boxes of Christmas decorations, Thomas's old workbench, the water heater humming in its corner, the furnace squatting like a dormant beast. And there, near the far wall, I saw Ray's toolbox sitting open, his flashlight lying on the concrete floor, its beam pointing toward the old storage room we'd always kept locked. The storage room door hung open. That stopped me cold. That door had been locked since Thomas died. I didn't even know where the key was anymore. We'd used that room for his workshop supplies, things he'd meant to organize but never quite got around to before the cancer took him. After he passed, I'd simply locked it and tried not to think about it. Ray? I moved closer, my shadow stretching long in the flashlight's beam. The storage room gaped dark beyond the open doorway, and I could smell something strange emanating from it. Not quite decay, but old air, stale and thick. Ray's phone lay just outside the doorway, screen cracked. I picked it up with trembling fingers. The screen flickered to life, showing his last call. To me, duration 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Ended 12 minutes ago. Where was he? I directed the flashlight into the storage room, and its beam caught something that made my breath stop. There, on the back wall, someone had removed several boards, creating a gap about 3 feet square. Behind those boards, the flashlight's beam disappeared into darkness. Not just the darkness of a closed room, but a deeper dark, the kind that suggests space, depth. And on the floor, just at the edge of that opening, lay Ray's work glove. I should have run. Every survival instinct should have sent me scrambling up those stairs and out of that house. But I'm an old woman who's buried a husband and weathered more storms than I can count. And fear had long ago been tempered into something more practical. Caution, married to curiosity. I stepped into the storage room. The opening in the wall wasn't just a gap, it was deliberate, calculated. Someone had carefully removed those boards, prying out nails that looked decades old. Beyond the opening, I could see rough stone and dirt, and the unmistakable shape of a tunnel. A tunnel. Beneath my house. A tunnel that had been hidden behind that locked storage room wall for decades. How long had it been there? Had Thomas known about it? Had he been the one to board it up? The flashlight beam caught something else. Scratches on the concrete floor, fresh ones, as if something had been dragged. They led into the tunnel and disappeared into that waiting darkness. "Ray?" My voice came out as a whisper now. From deep within the tunnel, I heard something. Not quite a voice, not quite a sound, just a disturbance in the air, like someone breathing in a space that had been still for far too long. And then, clear as a bell, I heard footsteps. Not Ray's boots on concrete, something else. Something softer, but deliberate. Coming closer. I backed out of the storage room quickly, my heart now genuinely racing. I grabbed Ray's toolbox and flashlight and made my way up the basement stairs faster than I'd moved in years. At the top, I slammed the door shut and, for the first time since installing it, used the deadbolt Thomas had put on the basement door. My hands shook as I dialed 911. "This is Margaret Allen at 4782 Old Mill Road," I said when the dispatcher answered. "I need police at my house immediately. The plumber I called has disappeared, and there's—" I paused, knowing how insane this would sound. There's a tunnel in my basement that shouldn't be there. Whatever I'd expected to find when I woke up this morning, it certainly wasn't this. And as I stood in my kitchen, listening to the dispatcher's calm questions, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. That tunnel had been waiting beneath my feet for decades. And now, someone, or something, was awake inside it. The police arrived within 15 minutes, which felt like 15 hours. 2 officers, Detective Sarah Golding and a younger patrolman named Officer Brooks, took my statement while standing in my kitchen, their eyes occasionally darting toward the locked basement door. "And you're certain the plumber went down there alone?" Detective Vasquez asked, pen poised over her notepad. I'd been mistaken about her name. The nameplate read, Vasquez, not Golding. Completely certain. I was the only other person home, and I left for the market. When you came back, the front door was open. Ajar. Not wide open, but definitely not closed like I'd left it. Officer Brooks had been examining the basement door. "Mrs. Allen, do you have the key for this deadbolt?" "It's the only lock on that door. It's not keyed, just the bolt you slide across." Detective Vasquez exchanged a glance with Brooks. "So anyone could lock or unlock it from this side?" "Yes, but there's no lock on the basement side. Thomas, my late husband, installed it years ago when the children were small. We were worried about them wandering down there unsupervised." "I see." The detective closed her notepad. "We'll need to go down and take a look. You said there's a tunnel?" I nodded, feeling suddenly foolish. In the daylight, with 2 armed officers in my kitchen, the whole thing felt less real, like a story I'd invented. But Ray was still missing, and that tunnel was still there. Detective Vasquez led the way down the stairs, flashlight in one hand, other hand resting on her service weapon. Officer Brooks followed, and I brought up the rear, despite their suggestions that I wait upstairs. "This is my house," I said firmly. "I'm coming." The basement looked different now, less threatening in the presence of official authority. They examined Ray's abandoned tools, his cracked phone, the open storage room door. When they saw the gap in the wall, both officers stiffened. "How long have you lived here, Mrs. Allen?" Detective Vasquez asked, crouching near the opening. 43 years. "And you never knew this was here?" "Never. That storage room has been locked since my husband passed. 7 years now." Officer Brooks shone his flashlight into the tunnel. "It goes back pretty far. Looks old. Could be from Prohibition era. Lots of houses around here had tunnels for bootlegging." Bootlegging. The word felt absurd in my mouth. "In Millbrook?" "You'd be surprised, ma'am. This whole county was wet during Prohibition. Lots of folks needed ways to move product without being seen." He paused. "But this looks maintained. The supports are solid, and there's no cobwebs near the entrance." That observation sent a chill through me. Someone had been using this tunnel recently. Detective Vasquez stood up. "I'm calling this in. We need a full team down here." She looked at me seriously. "Mrs. Allen, I need you to think carefully. Have you noticed anything unusual recently? Sounds in the night? Items moved? Anything out of place?" I opened my mouth to say no, then stopped. "The door." "What door?" "The storage room door. It was locked. I don't know where the key is. Haven't seen it in years." "How did it get open? Could the plumber have picked it?" "Why would he? He was here to fix the kitchen sink." Officer Brooks spoke up. "Maybe he heard something. Same thing that spooked him when he called you. Could be he was investigating, picked the lock, found the tunnel. Then where is he?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Detective Vasquez made her call, requesting backup and what she termed a structural assessment team. While we waited, she asked more questions. About Thomas, about when we'd bought the house, about whether we'd done any major renovations that might have revealed the tunnel. "Thomas handled most of the repairs himself," I explained. "He was a carpenter by trade. He redid the upstairs bathroom, refinished all the floors, replaced the roof twice. But he never mentioned a tunnel. Could he have known about it and not told you?" The question stung more than it should have. My husband and I shared everything. But even as I said it, doubt crept in. Thomas had his secrets, small ones, harmless ones. His workshop was his domain, and I'd respected that. What if the tunnel had been another secret? Something he'd discovered and chosen to handle on his own. More officers arrived, along with a man in coveralls who introduced himself as Frank Morrison, a county inspector specializing in historical structures. He disappeared into the tunnel with a heavy-duty lamp and camera, leaving the rest of us waiting in the basement like anxious relatives outside an operating room. My phone rang. Scott's name flashed on the screen. "Mom, I just heard on the police scanner that there are cops at your house. What's going on?" Of course he'd been listening to the scanner. Scott had always been fascinated by police work, though he'd ended up in insurance instead. "There's been an incident. A plumber went missing." "Missing? At your house? Mom, are you all right?" "I'm fine. The police are here now. I'm coming over." He hung up before I could protest. 30 minutes later, Frank Morrison emerged from the tunnel, covered in dust and looking troubled. He pulled Detective Vasquez aside, and they conferred in low voices. I caught fragments. At least 80 years old. Multiple exits. Recent activity. Scott arrived as they were finishing, bursting into the basement with Vanessa trailing behind him. My son looked so much like Thomas at that age. Tall, broad-shouldered, prematurely graying. But where Thomas had been gentle, Scott had developed a hardness over the years, especially since marrying Vanessa. "Mom," he grabbed my shoulders. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Scott. Please don't fuss." Vanessa stood back, her designer coat looking absurdly out of place in my dusty basement. She'd never liked this house, thought I should sell it and move into one of those sterile retirement communities. Her perfectly made-up face showed what might have been concern, but her eyes were calculating, taking in the scene with cool assessment. "Mrs. Allen called a plumber who subsequently disappeared," Detective Vasquez explained. "We're investigating." "Disappeared?" Scott's face darkened. "From the house?" "From the basement. We found a tunnel behind that wall." Scott stared at the opening, then at me. "A tunnel? How is that possible? How long has it been there?" "We don't know yet," I said. "I certainly didn't know about it." Vanessa stepped closer, peering into the storage room. "This is the room that was always locked, isn't it? The one with Thomas's things?" Something in her tone made me defensive. "Yes. And you never cleaned it out? Never went through his belongings?" "Vanessa," Scott warned. "I'm just saying, if she'd dealt with this room years ago like I suggested, maybe this wouldn't have happened." The implication hung in the air. This was somehow my fault. My negligence, my sentimentality, my refusal to let go of the past had led to this moment. Before I could respond, Frank Morrison cleared his throat. "Folks, I need everyone to clear out of this basement. This tunnel system is extensive and potentially unstable. I've documented 3 separate exit points within 100 yards of this house, all carefully concealed. Someone has definitely been using these tunnels recently. within the last few weeks, I'd estimate. Someone's been under my house? My voice came out smaller than I intended. Yes, ma'am. And based on what I found, they've been coming and going regularly. Scott exploded. That's it. Mom, you can't stay here. Pack a bag. You're coming home with us. I'm not leaving my house. Mom, someone has been sneaking around under your house. This isn't safe. Scott's right, Margaret. Vanessa used my first name like we were friends, which we weren't. You really should consider your options. At your age, living alone in a house with secret tunnels, what will people think? What will people think? As if that mattered more than finding Ray Castillo or understanding what was happening in my own home. I'm staying, I said firmly. Detective Vasquez intervened. Mrs. Allen, while we can't force you to leave, I would recommend having someone stay with you until we figure out what's going on. We'll post an officer outside tonight, but I'll stay, a voice said from the basement stairs. We all turned. Claire stood there, my daughter, looking travel-worn and determined. She must have driven straight through from Michigan. Mom called me after she talked to 911, Claire explained, descending the stairs. Took me 3 hours, but I'm here. Relief flooded through me. Claire understood. She always had. Scott frowned. Claire, you didn't have to drive all this way. Vanessa and I can handle this. Mom doesn't need handling, Scott. She needs support. Claire came to stand beside me, and I felt her hand slip into mine. I'll stay with her until this gets sorted out. Vanessa's expression tightened, but she said nothing. Scott looked between his sister and me, clearly conflicted between his desire to control the situation and his reluctance to argue with Claire. Detective Vasquez checked her watch. It's getting late. We're going to seal this basement as a crime scene until we complete our investigation. Mrs. Allen, I'll need you to stay out of here until we give you clearance. Of course. As everyone began filing upstairs, Frank Morrison touched my arm. Mrs. Allen, one more thing. In the tunnel, I found this. He handed me a plastic evidence bag containing a photograph, old and faded. I held it up to the light and felt the world tilt again. The photograph showed this house, my house, but decades younger. And standing on the front porch were 4 people I didn't recognize. 3 men in suits and a woman in a long dress. But written on the back, visible through the plastic, were words that made my blood run cold. The Millbrook Collective, 1943. I'd never heard of any Millbrook Collective. Do you recognize any of these people? Morrison asked. I shook my head, unable to speak. Well, they knew this house. And based on where I found this, tucked into a support beam about 50 feet into the tunnel, they knew about the tunnels too. That night, after the police had gone and Scott and Vanessa had reluctantly left, Claire and I sat in my kitchen drinking tea. The basement door had been officially sealed with police tape, and an officer sat in a cruiser outside my front door. Mom, Claire said gently, what aren't you telling me? I looked at my daughter, so much like I'd been at her age. Direct, intuitive, unwilling to accept surface explanations. I don't know what you mean. You got very quiet when they showed you that photograph. And earlier, when Scott asked about Dad never mentioning the tunnel, you hesitated. Had I? I thought I'd controlled my reaction better than that. It's nothing. Just a strange day. Claire set down her tea. Mom, someone has been living in tunnels under your house. A man has disappeared. The police found evidence of recent activity. This isn't nothing. She was right, of course. And there was something I hadn't told anyone. Something I'd been turning over in my mind all evening. The photograph, I said slowly. The one they found in the tunnel. I don't recognize the people, but I recognize something else. What? The woman in the photograph is wearing a brooch. A very distinctive brooch, silver, with 3 interlocked circles. So, I stood up and walked to the old secretary desk in the corner of the kitchen, the one that had belonged to Thomas's mother. From the bottom drawer, I pulled out a small velvet box and opened it. Inside lay a brooch, silver, 3 interlocked circles, identical to the one in the photograph. Thomas's mother gave this to me on our wedding day, I explained. She said it had been in the family for generations, that it represented continuity, loyalty, and secrets kept. Claire stared at the brooch. Secrets kept? That's what she said. At the time, I thought it was just poetic. Now? I trailed off, looking toward the sealed basement door. Now you think Dad's family knew about the tunnels. I think they might have done more than know about them, Claire. I think they might have built them. My daughter's face went pale. Mom, what are you saying? Before I could answer, the house phone rang. The landline I'd kept out of habit despite Claire's insistence that cell phones were enough. I picked it up. Heavy breathing. Then a voice, distorted and mechanical. Stop asking questions, Margaret. Some secrets should stay buried. The line went dead. Claire was already dialing 911 on her cell phone when we heard it. A sound from deep in the basement, beyond the sealed door and the police tape. The sound of something heavy being dragged. And then, clear as a bell, echoing up through the floorboards, Ray Castillo's voice, screaming for help. The officer from the cruiser burst through the front door within seconds of Claire's call, weapon drawn. 2 more patrol cars arrived minutes later, their sirens tearing through the quiet night. Detective Vasquez appeared 20 minutes after that, looking exhausted but alert. "You're certain it was his voice?" she asked me for the 3rd time. "Completely certain. He was screaming for help." They'd searched the basement again, this time with dogs and thermal imaging equipment. They'd found nothing. No Ray, no evidence he'd been there beyond his abandoned tools. The tunnel entrances Frank Morrison had documented earlier were all sealed from the outside, undisturbed. "It's impossible," Officer Brooks muttered. "We cleared that basement. There's nowhere for a person to hide down there." But I knew what I'd heard. Claire had heard it too. Detective Vasquez pulled me aside while the other officers continued their search. "Mrs. Allen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. Is there any chance, any possibility, that your late husband was involved in something illegal? Something that might explain these tunnels and the recent activity?" The question should have offended me. Instead, it crystallized a fear I'd been harboring since seeing that photograph. Thomas had been a good man, a kind man, but there had been parts of his life he'd kept separate from me. His childhood, his parents, the years before we met. He'd spoken of them rarely and vaguely. "I don't know," I admitted. "He never spoke much about his family history." "What about his mother? The one who gave you the brooch?" "She died before Scott was born. I only met her a handful of times. She was distant, formal." Vasquez made a note. "And his father?" "Died when Thomas was young." "A car accident," he said. "Did you ever verify that?" The question struck me as odd. Why would I verify it? Because sometimes, Mrs. Allen, people hide their pasts for reasons that aren't immediately apparent. And sometimes those hidden pasts have consequences that outlive them. After the police finally left, again posting an officer outside but finding no trace of Ray, Claire and I sat in the living room. Neither of us could sleep. The house felt different now, its familiar contours hiding unknown depths. "We need to find out about Dad's family," Claire said. "Really find out. Not just the stories he told us." "How do we do that?" "Tomorrow we go to the county records office. Look up property deeds, death certificates, anything that might tell us who really owned this house before you and Dad." I nodded, though the thought of investigating my dead husband's past felt like a betrayal. But Ray Castillo was missing. Someone had threatened me. And a tunnel system stretched beneath my feet like a secret circulatory system. The next morning, I woke to find Scott's car in my driveway. He and Vanessa were sitting on the porch, waiting. From their expressions, they'd been there a while. "We need to talk," Scott said without preamble. Claire appeared behind me in the doorway. "Scott, it's barely 7 in the morning. This can't wait." He pushed past me into the house, Vanessa following. "Mom, Vanessa's uncle is a real estate attorney. We had him look into the property records last night." "You did what?" I felt my face flush. "You had no right." "I had every right. You're my mother, and you're in danger." Scott pulled out a folder from his briefcase. "This house has a complicated history, Mom. A history Dad apparently never told you about." He spread documents across my kitchen table, photocopies of old deeds, property transfers, legal filings. Claire and I leaned in to look. "The house was built in 1912 by a man named Josiah Allen," Scott explained. "Dad's grandfather. But it wasn't originally a farmhouse. Look at this original filing. I read the faded text. Commercial property, registered for manufacturing purposes. Manufacturing what? Claire asked. Vanessa spoke up, her voice carrying a note of triumph. Josiah Allen was a bootlegger during Prohibition, a major one. He ran an entire operation out of this house and several others in the county. The tunnels weren't just for transport, they were part of a network that connected multiple properties. I stared at the documents, seeing my home in an entirely new light. Thomas never said anything about this. There's more, Scott continued, pulling out another document. In 1943, Josiah Allen died under suspicious circumstances. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but there was an investigation. Several people testified about his involvement in something called the Millbrook Collective, the name from the photograph. What was the Millbrook Collective? I asked. That's where the records get fuzzy, Scott admitted. It seems to have been some kind of organization or group, but there's no clear documentation of what they did. What we do know is that several members died within a year of Josiah's death, and the property passed to his son, Dad's father, who died just 10 years later. The car accident, I whispered. Except it wasn't an accident. Vanessa pulled out a newspaper clipping, yellow with age. Theodore Allen drove his car off Millbrook Bridge in 1953. The police ruled it suicide. The room spun. Thomas's father had killed himself? And Thomas had never mentioned it? Claire gripped my hand. Why would Dad lie about this? Because shame follows families, Vanessa said, not unkindly for once. Bootlegging, suspicious deaths, suicide, these aren't things people advertise. Your father probably wanted to protect you from all of it. But was that true? Or had Thomas been protecting something else? Something still hidden in those tunnels? There's one more thing, Scott said quietly. The property records show several underground structures registered with the county. Not just tunnels, but rooms, storage facilities. At least one large chamber that was described as a gathering space. Mom, there's something down there. Something bigger than what the police have found so far. Before I could respond, my phone rang. Detective Vasquez. Mrs. Allen, we found Ray Castillo. Relief flooded through me. Thank goodness. Is he all right? A pause. He's alive. But Mrs. Allen, we need you to come to the hospital. There's something you need to hear. 20 minutes later, we were all in Ray's hospital room. Me, Claire, Scott, Vanessa, and Detective Vasquez. Ray looked terrible, pale and shaking, with cuts and bruises covering his arms. But he was alive. Tell them what you told me, Vasquez said gently. Ray's eyes found mine, and I saw real fear there. Mrs. Allen, I'm so sorry. I should have never gone down there. Just tell us what happened, Ray. I was checking the pipes near the water heater when I heard it. A voice coming from behind the wall. At first, I thought maybe it was a radio or sound carrying from outside. But then I heard it clearly, someone calling for help. From the tunnel? I didn't know it was a tunnel then. I just knew someone sounded distressed. I found the storage room door was unlocked. Unlocked? I interrupted. Not picked? No, ma'am. Just unlocked. Like someone wanted me to find it. I went in, saw the boards had been removed, and I could see the opening. That's when I called you. But the call dropped. Ray shook his head. No, ma'am. Someone hit me. From behind. I felt hands on my neck, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was deep in the tunnel system, in some kind of room. Stone walls, old furniture, filing cabinets. And there were documents everywhere. Papers, photographs, ledgers. Detective Vasquez leaned forward. What kind of documents? Names, dates, money transfers. It looked like records from the 1940s, maybe earlier. And there were photographs. Lots of them. Groups of people in what looked like meetings or ceremonies. I saw your house in some of them, Mrs. Allen. Did you see anyone else down there? Whoever hit you? That's the thing. Ray's voice dropped to a whisper. I never saw anyone. But I heard them, moving around in the tunnels, always just out of sight, and they kept talking to me. Talking to you? What did they say? They said I'd stumbled onto something that should have stayed hidden, that the Millbrook Collective protected its secrets. That if I valued my life, I'd forget everything I'd seen. The room went silent. Finally, Scott spoke. How did you get out? I don't know. I must have passed out from fear or dehydration. When I woke up, I was lying in a field about a mile from your property, Mrs. Allen. A farmer found me and called 911. Detective Vasquez pulled out her phone and showed Ray a photograph, the one found in the tunnel, showing the 4 people and the woman with the brooch. Do you recognize any of these people from the documents you saw? Ray studied the photo and nodded slowly. The man on the left. I saw his name on several documents. Josiah Allen. And the woman with the brooch. She was in a lot of the photographs. But I don't remember her name. I did. Suddenly, with horrible clarity, I remembered. Eleanor, I said. Her name was Eleanor Allen, Thomas's grandmother. The woman who had owned my brooch before me. The woman who had been part of the Millbrook Collective. Vanessa pulled out her phone. I'm looking up Eleanor Allen now. Her fingers flew across the screen. Here. Eleanor Allen, née Blackwood. Born 1895, died 1971. But look at this. She didn't die in Millbrook. She died at Riverside State Hospital. That's a psychiatric facility, Claire said. It was the county asylum back then, Vanessa corrected. Eleanor Allen spent the last 12 years of her life in a mental institution. Scott grabbed the phone from his wife, reading quickly. It says she was committed in 1959 by her son Theodore, Dad's father, 6 years after his supposed suicide. But if Theodore died in 1953, Claire said slowly, how could he have committed his mother in 1959? The implications hung in the air like smoke. Theodore Allen hadn't died in 1953. The suicide was a fabrication. But why? What had Thomas's father been hiding? Detective Vasquez was already on her phone, making calls. I need records for Theodore Allen, supposedly deceased 1953. And I need access to files from Riverside State Hospital for Eleanor Allen, patient from 1959 to 1971. While she worked, I sat down heavily. Everything I thought I knew about my husband's family was unraveling. Thomas had lied to me, or at least someone had lied to him, and he'd never bothered to verify the truth. Ray spoke again, his voice weak. There's something else, Mrs. Allen. In that room, in the tunnels, I found a journal. I couldn't take it with me, but I read some of it while I was trapped. It was written by someone named Eleanor. She wrote about the collective, about their purpose. She said they were guardians. Guardians of what? She didn't say exactly, but she wrote that Millbrook sat on top of something important, something that had to be protected at all costs. She said the tunnels were just the beginning, that there were deeper levels, places where the real secrets were kept. My mouth went dry. Deeper levels? Mrs. Allen, what I saw down there, that wasn't just bootlegging tunnels. Someone built something much larger, much more complex. And based on that journal, they're still using it. Detective Vasquez ended her call and turned to face us. I've got teams going through county records now. But Mrs. Allen, I need to ask you, did your husband ever mention anything called Project Millbrook? I shook my head. Because I just got off the phone with a federal agent who's very interested in your property. Apparently, during World War II, several classified government projects were hidden in rural areas across the country. Millbrook was one of the designated sites. Government projects? I felt like I was falling down a rabbit hole with no bottom. What kind of projects? That's classified. But the agent said that if your property was part of Project Millbrook, then the tunnels and underground structures would be considered federal property, not private. And anyone accessing them without authorization would be committing a federal crime. Scott stood abruptly. This is insane. Mom, you need to sell this house immediately. Whatever's down there, it's not worth the danger. But I wasn't listening to Scott. I was thinking about Thomas, about the man I'd shared my life with for 36 years. Had he known? Had he been part of this Millbrook collective? Whatever it was? Had he been protecting me or hiding something from me? And then another thought struck me, cold and terrifying. The threatening phone call had used my first name. The voice had been distorted, but the familiarity was there. Someone who knew me was involved in this. I looked around the hospital room at the faces of my family. Scott, anxious and controlling. Vanessa, too interested in the property records, too quick with information. Even Claire, my ally. How much did I really know about her life, her finances, her reasons for dropping everything to drive here? Detective Vasquez, I said carefully, when you searched the basement, did you find any evidence of how someone could enter the house from the tunnels? A way to get from underground into my living space? She frowned. No. All the tunnel access points were sealed from inside the house. Why? Because someone opened that storage room door. Ray said it was unlocked, not picked, which means someone with access to my house deliberately opened it. You think someone in your household? I think someone wants me out of this house. And I think they've been working toward that goal for a while now. The room erupted in protest from Scott and Vanessa, but I kept my eyes on Claire. My daughter met my gaze steadily, and I saw something there I hadn't noticed before. Guilt. Claire, I said softly. What aren't you telling me? My daughter's face crumpled. Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know it would come to this. Claire? Scott's voice was sharp. What did you do? 3 months ago, I got a call, Claire said, tears streaming down her face. Someone said they were from a historical preservation society. They wanted to know about the house, about Dad's family history. They offered me money, good money, if I could convince you to let them study the property. How much money? I asked, my voice steady despite the betrayal cutting through me. $50,000. Mom, Jason lost his job, and we're behind on our mortgage. I thought it was legitimate. I thought it was just historians wanting to study an old house. Did you give them information about the house? The layout? My schedule? Claire nodded miserably. They asked questions, and I answered them. I never imagined they wanted to hurt you. Vanessa's voice cut through the room like a knife. You led criminals to your mother's house for money? What's wrong with you? But I barely heard her. I was thinking about the unlocked storage room door, about how someone had known exactly when I'd be at the market, about how they'd used Ray's presence as cover to access the tunnels. Claire, I said carefully, do you still have contact information for these people? She nodded, pulling out her phone with shaking hands. Good, I said, standing up with a resolve I hadn't felt in years. Because we're going to set a trap. And we're going to find out exactly what the Millbrook Collective is really protecting. Detective Vasquez started to protest, but I silenced her with a look that surprised even me. That's my house, my history, my family's secrets, and I'm done being a victim. For the first time since Ray's disappearance, I felt in control. Someone had been manipulating me, using my children, trying to force me out of my own home. But they'd made a critical mistake. They'd underestimated a 67-year-old widow who'd survived far worse than hidden tunnels and family betrayals. They were about to learn that lesson the hard way. The plan came together in Detective Vasquez's office over the next 2 hours. Claire would contact the Historical Preservation Society and tell them I was willing to meet. She'd claim I was frightened and ready to cooperate, willing to give them access to the house in exchange for answers about my husband's past. They'll smell a trap, Scott protested. He'd been arguing against the plan since we left the hospital, his face red with frustration. Maybe, Vasquez agreed. But Mrs. Allen is right. We need to draw them out. Ray's kidnapping gives us probable cause, but we need to connect it to whoever's been using those tunnels. This is our best chance. Vanessa sat quietly in the corner, her earlier smugness replaced by something that looked almost like respect. If you're going to do this, Margaret, you should know what you're risking. These people, whoever they are, they've already demonstrated they're willing to use violence. I'm aware, I said dryly, which is why we'll have police presence the entire time. Claire made the call while we listened on speakerphone. A man answered on the 3rd ring, his voice smooth and educated. Claire, I was hoping you'd reach out. My mother knows, Claire said, her voice trembling. Whether from genuine emotion or acting, I couldn't tell. She knows I gave you information. She's terrified and angry, but she wants answers. She's willing to talk. A pause. What kind of answers does she want? About the Millbrook Collective, about my father's family, about what's really under her house. Those are dangerous questions, Claire. She deserves to know the truth, and she's willing to cooperate if you'll just talk to her. She says she'll give you access to the property, to the tunnels, to everything, but she wants to understand why. Another long pause. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Tell your mother to be alone. We'll call with the location. She wants to meet at the house. No, neutral ground. We'll call. The line went dead. Detective Vasquez immediately started making calls, coordinating with federal agents and putting together a tactical response team. I listened with half my attention, the other half turning over everything I'd learned about Thomas's family. That evening, back at the house with a police guard outside and Claire sleeping upstairs, I made a decision. If someone wanted me out of my home, there had to be a reason. Something in this house they desperately needed access to. Something they couldn't get while I was living here. I started in Thomas's old workshop in the garage, the one place I'd largely left untouched since his death. Tools hung on pegboards, organized with the precision that had defined my husband's work. His workbench held half-finished projects, sketches for furniture, measurement notes in his careful handwriting. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested secret conspiracies or hidden legacies. But then I remembered what Ray had said. Filing cabinets in the underground room. Documents. Records. If Thomas had been part of the Millbrook Collective, if he'd known about the tunnels, he would have kept records somewhere. I searched more carefully, looking not for what was present, but what was absent. The workshop was organized, but there were gaps, spaces on shelves where something should be, a file drawer that seemed too shallow for its housing. On impulse, I pulled the drawer completely out of the filing cabinet. Behind it, recessed into the cabinet's backing, was a metal box. My hands shook as I pried it free. It was locked, but the key, I knew where that was. The brooch. The silver brooch with 3 interlocked circles that Eleanor Allen had given me. I retrieved it from my jewelry box and examined it more carefully. One of the circles was actually a cover, hinged so subtly I'd never noticed. Behind it was a small key. The box opened with a soft click. Inside were documents, dozens of them. Property deeds going back to 1912. Membership list for the Millbrook Collective with names I recognized from town history. Financial records showing massive payments from the federal government during the 1940s. And letters, dozens of letters, in Thomas's handwriting. I read them by lamplight, each one driving another stake through my heart. Father made me promise never to tell Margaret, one read. The collective's work must continue in secret, even from those we love. The burden of knowledge is too great, and she deserves peace. Another, I've maintained the tunnels as Father instructed, though I pray I never have to use them. The cash below must remain secure. Lives depend on it. And finally, dated just 2 months before his cancer diagnosis. If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. The collective has rules about succession, about who inherits the responsibility of guardianship. Scott isn't ready. He's too impulsive, too eager to prove himself. Claire is too trusting. Margaret is strong enough, but I've kept this from her too long. Forgive me. The key to the lower chamber is where we first danced. I sat back, stunned. Thomas had been a guardian, part of an organization that stretched back generations, protecting something hidden deep beneath my house. And he'd kept it from me our entire marriage. The betrayal felt fresh and raw, as if he'd died yesterday instead of 7 years ago. But what did he mean about the key being where we first danced? We'd first danced at the Millbrook Community Center at a summer social in 1981. That building had been torn down 15 years ago. Unless... I stood abruptly. We'd danced there at the social, but the first time Thomas and I had danced together, really danced, just the two of us, had been in this house. In the living room, late at night, with rain hammering the windows and Nat King Cole on the radio. I went to the living room and stood where we'd stood 43 years ago. The floorboards were original to the house, refinished multiple times but never replaced. Thomas had been particular about that. I knelt and examined them carefully. One board, right in the center of where we would have danced, had a subtle difference in grain. I pressed it, and it gave slightly under my hand. It took me 20 minutes to figure out the mechanism, but eventually the board lifted, revealing a hollow space beneath. Inside was another metal box, larger than the first. This one contained a leather journal, a ring of keys, and a sealed envelope addressed to me in Thomas's handwriting. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began. "If you've found this, it means either I've told you everything or circumstances have forced you to discover the truth on your own. I pray for the former, but I fear the latter. Forgive me for my cowardice." The letter went on to explain everything. The Millbrook Collective had been formed in 1912 by Josiah Allen and 3 other prominent families in the county. During Prohibition, they'd built the tunnels ostensibly for bootlegging, but the real purpose was to create a secure network for what would come later. In 1942, the federal government had approached the collective with a proposition. Millbrook's geography and the existing tunnel system made it ideal for storing classified materials during the war. Documents, prototypes, research materials that couldn't fall into enemy hands. The collective had agreed, and a massive underground storage facility had been constructed beneath several properties in Millbrook, with the central hub beneath what would become my house. After the war, the government had maintained the facility, using the collective as caretakers and guardians. "The materials stored below are still classified," Thomas wrote. "Documents related to wartime research that the government doesn't want public. Some of it is historical, but some remains relevant to national security. The collective's purpose evolved from bootlegging to guardianship. We protect these secrets. But there's a problem. Not everyone in the collective believes the secrets should remain hidden. A faction has been arguing for disclosure, claiming the public has a right to know. The schism has created conflict, and I fear it may turn violent. If you're reading this, you've become involved whether you wished it or not. The keys in this box will grant you access to the lower chamber. Use them wisely. Trust no one who claims to speak for the collective unless they can show you the mark." The mark. I looked at the brooch again, at the 3 interlocked circles. That was the mark, the symbol of the original Millbrook Collective. A sound from upstairs made me freeze. Claire should be asleep. The police officer was outside, but I distinctly heard footsteps, soft and deliberate, moving through my bedroom. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but it was dead. Battery drained, though I'd charged it fully that evening. The footsteps moved to the hallway, toward the stairs. I quickly replaced the floorboard and shoved the metal box and its contents into my cardigan pockets. My heart hammered as I moved quietly toward the kitchen, toward the back door. But before I could reach it, the lights went out. Complete darkness. The kind that only comes when every circuit in a house has been cut. "Margaret." The voice came from the darkness behind me, distorted like the one on the phone. "You should have left when you had the chance." I ran. My 67-year-old legs carried me faster than they had in years, muscle memory guiding me through my own house in the dark. I made it to the back door, yanked it open, and found 2 figures standing on my porch, backlit by moonlight. "Mrs. Allen," one of them said, and I recognized the voice from Claire's phone call. "We need to talk. Now." Behind me, the footsteps from inside the house grew closer. I was trapped. "The officer outside," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll scream and he'll come. Officer Patterson is taking an unexpected nap in his cruiser," the man said. "A mild sedative in his coffee thermos. He'll wake up with a headache and no memory of the last hour. Now please come with us. We don't want to hurt you, but we will if necessary." "Who are you?" "We're what's left of the Millbrook Collective. The real collective, not the government lapdogs your husband served. And you have something that belongs to us." "I don't know what you're talking about." "The keys, Margaret, the access codes, the location of the primary storage vault. Your husband hid that information before he died, and we believe he told you where to find it. He didn't tell me anything." The man stepped closer, and in the moonlight I could see he was young. Younger than Scott, with cold eyes and a professional bearing. "Then we'll have to search for it ourselves. And you'll need to come with us to ensure Claire doesn't do anything foolish like call the police before we're finished." "Claire's asleep upstairs." "Claire is in our vehicle," the second figure said, and I recognized Vanessa's voice. "She's unharmed, but that status is contingent on your cooperation." Vanessa, my son's wife, part of this all along. "Scott doesn't know," Vanessa continued, reading my expression. Your son is a good man, but a simple one. He has no idea who he married. The betrayal cut deeper than Thomas's secrets. Vanessa had been in my home, around my family for 5 years. Every dinner, every holiday, every casual conversation, all of it a lie. What about Ray? I asked. What was the point of terrorizing him? Ray wasn't supposed to be here, the young man said. His arrival disrupted our timeline. We'd planned to access the tunnels while you were out, retrieve what we needed, and leave without anyone knowing. But your plumber got curious, found the open passage we'd created, and forced our hand. You opened the storage room door. You wanted me to find the tunnel. Actually, no. That was an accident. One of our team members was careless. But once you'd called the police, we had to accelerate our plans. He gestured toward the house. Now, the keys, please. I touched my pocket, feeling the metal box there. These people didn't know I'd found Thomas's letter or the journal. They thought I was still ignorant, still vulnerable. That gave me an advantage. The keys are in the house, I said. In Thomas's workshop. I only just figured out where he hid them. It was a partial truth, the best kind of lie. Show us. They escorted me back inside, one on each side. The person who'd been inside the house, I still couldn't see them clearly, joined us in the kitchen. Check on the officer, Vanessa instructed them. Make sure he's still unconscious. The figure moved toward the front door, and in the dim light filtering through the windows, I caught a glimpse of their face. Scott, my son, my firstborn, part of this conspiracy against me. You knew? I asked Vanessa, my voice breaking despite my attempt to stay strong. He joined the collective 3 years ago, she said matter-of-factly. I recruited him. Once we were married, it wasn't difficult to convince him that the old guard, people like your husband, were on the wrong side of history. The materials in the vault below could change the world, Margaret. Medical research, technological advances, historical truths that have been suppressed for decades. The public deserves to know, and if the government designated them classified, if releasing them could endanger lives, that's propaganda. The real reason for secrecy is power, control. Your husband and his father and his grandfather before him served corrupt masters. We're correcting that mistake. Scott returned, his face flushed. He's still out. We have maybe 20 minutes before the shift change. My son couldn't meet my eyes. In that moment, I saw the truth. Scott wasn't a true believer in their cause. He was a follower, desperate to prove himself significant, easily manipulated by a wife who understood his weaknesses. The workshop, the young man prompted. Show us. I led them through the kitchen toward the garage, my mind racing. The police shift change was in 20 minutes. Claire was held hostage somewhere. I had information these people desperately wanted, and they had no qualms about using violence. But I also had Thomas's keys, his journal, and his letter. I knew things they didn't. And I was about to prove that wisdom and experience trumped youth and arrogance. It's in the filing cabinet, I said, opening the workshop door, behind the second drawer. As they crowded around the cabinet, I made my move. I hit the emergency switch Thomas had installed years ago, a direct line to the fire department that would bring them in under 2 minutes. Alarms shrieked through the house. Lights flooded the property. What did you do? The young man shouted. My husband wasn't just a guardian, I said calmly, backing toward the door. He was a carpenter who built safety features into every structure he touched. That's a fire alarm connected directly to the station. They'll be here in 90 seconds, and they'll find Officer Patterson drugged in his cruiser, you trespassing in my home, and my daughter missing. Vanessa lunged for me, but I was already moving. 67 years old, but I'd spent 4 decades maintaining this property, walking these acres, staying active and strong. I made it out of the workshop and slammed the door, throwing the external bolt Thomas had installed. It would hold them for maybe 60 seconds. Long enough. Scott was shouting from inside, begging me to let them out. I ignored my son's pleas and ran toward the front of the house, where the fire truck's sirens were already audible in the distance. Officer Patterson was stirring in his cruiser, groggy but alive. I yanked open his door. Radio, I gasped. Hostage situation, My daughter Claire. They have her." He fumbled for his radio, training overriding confusion. Within seconds, the frequency was alive with urgent communications. The fire trucks arrived first, then more police cars. Detective Vasquez screeched to a stop in my driveway 30 seconds later, weapon drawn. "The workshop," I told her. "3 suspects, armed and dangerous, and they have my daughter somewhere." The next 10 minutes were chaos. The suspects surrendered without violence. Even true believers know when they're beaten. Scott emerged looking broken, Vanessa defiant, the young man coldly calculating his legal options. Claire was found in a van parked half a mile away, blindfolded but unharmed. She collapsed into my arms, sobbing apologies I wasn't ready to hear. But it wasn't over. As the suspects were loaded into police cars, Vanessa caught my eye. "You only stopped 3 of us, Margaret," she said, smiling. "The collective has members you'd never suspect. This isn't finished." Detective Vasquez pushed her into the cruiser, but the words hung in the air like a curse. Back inside my violated home, I finally had a moment to breathe. The metal box in my pocket felt heavier than it should, weighted with implications. My phone rang, my landline, the one that hadn't been compromised. I answered. "Margaret Allen?" A woman's voice, official and cold. "Yes? This is Director Anna Morrison, National Security Division. We need to discuss your husband's legacy and the assets stored beneath your property. I'll be at your location in 3 hours. Don't go anywhere and don't access the lower chambers until I arrive." "How do you know?" "We've been monitoring the situation. Your husband was one of our most trusted guardians, and his death left complications. We'll discuss everything when I arrive. Until then, trust no one. The collective schism runs deeper than you know." The line went dead. I sat in my kitchen as dawn began to break, surrounded by police officers processing my home as a crime scene, my son in custody, my daughter traumatized, my house's secrets exposed but far from understood. And I realized that Thomas's letter had been right about one thing. I'd become involved whether I wished it or not. The only question now was whether I was strong enough to finish what my husband had started. Director Anna Morrison arrived exactly 3 hours later, as promised. She came in an unmarked black sedan with 2 agents who positioned themselves strategically around my property. The woman herself was in her 50s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a tailored suit that spoke of authority and no-nonsense efficiency. Detective Vasquez was still at my house, coordinating with federal agents who'd descended on Millbrook like a quiet invasion. She met Morrison at the door, and I watched them confer in low voices before both women entered my kitchen. "Mrs. Allen," Morrison said, extending her hand. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." I shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. "I'd like some answers, Director Morrison." "I'm sure you would. But first, I need to know exactly what you've discovered and who you've told." I'd expected this. The government's first priority would be containment, not truth. I pulled out Thomas's letter and the journal, keeping the keys in my pocket. "My husband left these for me. I've read them both." Morrison's expression didn't change as she took the documents, but I saw her jaw tighten slightly as she scanned Thomas's letter. "And the keys to the lower chamber?" "Safe. Mrs. Allen, I'm not your enemy, but I need those keys secured. The materials below are classified government documents from World War II and beyond," I interrupted. "Used to justify keeping my family as unpaid guardians for 3 generations. I know. It's more complicated than that." "Then uncomplicate it. Director Morrison, my son is in custody for attempting to kidnap me. My daughter-in-law was part of a conspiracy. A young man was terrorized in my basement. I've earned the right to understand what's been hidden beneath my feet for 43 years. Morrison studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Detective, would you give us the room?" Vasquez looked reluctant, but complied, closing the kitchen door behind her. Morrison sat down at my table. "Your husband's letter gave you the sanitized version. The truth is messier. In 1942, the Manhattan Project wasn't the only classified research program the government was running. There were dozens of others, some successful, some failures, some too dangerous to ever see the light of day." "What kind of research?" medical experiments, psychological warfare techniques, prototype weapons systems, documents detailing operations that violated international law. After the war, the government faced a dilemma. They couldn't destroy the records. Institutional knowledge is too valuable, but they couldn't risk them being discovered either. So they hid them in places like Millbrook, in places where loyal families would guard them. The collective wasn't just guardians, Mrs. Allen. They were accomplices. They knew what they were protecting, and they chose to help keep these secrets buried. The implication settled over me like a shroud. Thomas knew what was down there. He did, and like his father and grandfather before him, he made the choice to protect the government's interests over transparency. Why? Morrison leaned back. Because they believed, as I believe, that some secrets serve a greater good. The research methods documented below would destroy public trust in institutions that are necessary for national security. The weapons prototypes, if reverse-engineered by hostile nations, could shift the global balance of power. Your husband protected these secrets because releasing them would cause more harm than keeping them hidden. And the faction that Scott and Vanessa joined, the ones who want disclosure, they call themselves the New Collective. They believe transparency trumps security, that the public has a right to know about historical atrocities even if that knowledge destabilizes society. Morrison's expression hardened. They're idealists without understanding of consequences. If they gain access to the vault, they'll release everything online within hours. The geopolitical ramifications would be catastrophic. I thought about Scott, about how easily he'd been recruited to a cause that sounded noble, but led him to drugging police officers and holding his own sister hostage. Idealism without wisdom was just another form of foolishness. What happens now? I asked. Now, you make a choice. You can continue your husband's legacy as guardian of the vault, or you can relinquish that responsibility to government control. If you choose the former, you'll have our full support and protection. If you choose the latter, we'll need to acquire the property. Acquire it? This is my home. At fair market value, of course. Plus compensation for your family's decades of service. You'd be comfortable for the rest of your life. It was a generous offer. Too generous. Which meant there was something Morrison wasn't telling me. What's really in the vault, Director? What's so valuable that you're willing to pay off a stubborn old woman rather than simply seizing the property under national security provisions? Morrison's lips curved in something that might have been a smile. Thomas chose well. You're sharper than your son gives you credit for. Answer the question. She sighed. There's a section of the vault that contains documents from the Cold War era. Specifically, records of a program called Project Songbird. It involved cooperation between the U.S. government and individuals who would later be considered war criminals. Names, dates, payments, operations. If those documents became public, they would irreparably damage our relationships with key allies and provide ammunition to our adversaries. And you can't simply destroy them? They're part of an insurance policy. As long as we have them, certain international parties remain cooperative. If they're destroyed or released, that leverage disappears. It's ugly realpolitik, Mrs. Allen, but it's kept the peace for 70 years. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at my property, the farm where I'd raised my children, buried my husband, built a life. It had been standing on a foundation of secrets and moral compromises I'd never suspected. I need to see it, I said finally. The vault. I need to see what Thomas died protecting. That's not advisable. Those are my terms, Director. I see the vault, understand what I'm choosing to protect or expose, and then I make my decision. Otherwise, I'll call every news organization in the country and tell them exactly where to dig. It was a bluff, mostly, but Morrison didn't know that. Very well, she said after a long pause. But we go now, before the New Collective regroups. They have members we haven't identified yet, and they will try again. 20 minutes later, I descended into my basement surrounded by federal agents. They'd brought proper lighting, and the space looked different, less sinister, more like what it was, an old basement with hidden secrets. The tunnel entrance in the storage room had been widened by the agents' equipment. Morrison led the way, and I followed, my heart pounding not from fear but from anticipation. The tunnel was larger than I'd imagined, walls shored up with concrete and steel that looked far newer than the house above. We walked for what felt like minutes, but was probably only about 200 feet, descending gradually. Then we reached a door. Massive, steel, with a complex locking mechanism. "The keys," Morrison said. I pulled them from my pocket. There were 3, each different. Morrison showed me the sequence, and the door opened with a pneumatic hiss. Beyond was a chamber the size of a small warehouse, climate-controlled and lined with filing cabinets, shelves, and storage units. Document boxes were labeled with codes and dates going back to the 1940s. "This is one of 7 repositories," Morrison explained. "The others are in similar locations across the country, all guarded by families like yours." I walked along the rows, reading labels. Medical research, 1943, 1945. Psychological operations, 1950, 1955. Project Songbird, 1947, 1973. The weight of history pressed down on me. "How many people died because of what's documented here?" I asked. "Too many. But also, how many lives were saved by the intelligence gathered? How many wars were prevented by the leverage these documents provided? History isn't clean, Mrs. Allen." I stopped at a section labeled Millbrook Project Files, 1942 present. These would be the documents about this location, about the collective, about my husband's family. "May I?" Morrison hesitated, then nodded. "You've earned that right." I pulled out a file dated 1982, the year after Thomas and I married. Inside were documents detailing the transfer of guardianship from Theodore Allen to Thomas Allen, including psychological evaluations, background checks, and a handwritten letter from Thomas accepting the responsibility. "I understand the weight of this duty," Thomas had written in his careful script. "I will guard these secrets with my life and pass this responsibility to my children when the time comes. I will not burden my wife with this knowledge, as my father spared my mother. The less she knows, the safer she is. He'd protected me by lying to me, and I couldn't decide if that made me furious or grateful." Another file caught my eye. Eleanor Allen, Psychological Evaluation, 1959. I opened it and read the psychiatric reports from Riverside State Hospital. Eleanor hadn't been committed because she was insane. She'd been committed because she'd threatened to expose the collective and the vault. Theodore hadn't died in 1953. He'd faked his death to escape his mother's attempts to force him to reveal the truth. The Allen family history was built on lies layered upon lies, all in service of keeping these secrets. "I've seen enough," I said. Morrison led me back through the tunnel, and we emerged into my basement where Detective Vasquez and the other agents waited. "What's your decision?" Morrison asked. Before I could answer, there was a commotion upstairs. Raised voices, someone shouting. Vasquez's radio crackled. "We have a situation. Multiple vehicles approaching the property, armed individuals." Morrison swore under her breath. "The new collective. They're making their move. How did they know we were down here?" "They must have been watching." She turned to her agents. "Secure the vault entrance. No one gets past this point." We hurried upstairs to find the house surrounded by police and federal agents facing off against a group of about 20 people who'd formed a perimeter around my property. They weren't armed with guns. This was Illinois, after all. But they carried signs and cameras, and their intent was clear. This was a siege, not an attack. They were going public. I pushed past the agents to my front door and stepped out onto the porch. The crowd quieted when they saw me. "Mrs. Allen?" a woman called out. "We know what's under your house. The public has a right to know the truth." "You don't know anything," I called back. "You know there are secrets. You don't know what they are, or why they've been kept. Because the government wants to hide its crimes. Maybe. Or maybe because releasing certain information would endanger innocent lives." I descended the porch steps, ignoring Morrison's hissed warning behind me. "I've just come from the vault. I've seen what you're fighting to expose." The crowd pressed closer, cameras pointed at me like weapons. "And?" the woman demanded. "And I'm an old woman who's had her home invaded, her family torn apart, and her life upended because of secrets my husband kept from me. I'm tired of being a pawn in other people's games." I pulled out the keys to the vault. and held them up for everyone to see. These keys represent 70 years of hidden history, documents that could change how we view our government, our institutions, our past. Director Morrison wants me to continue guarding them. You want me to help expose them. The silence was absolute. Every eye was fixed on me. But here's what you all seem to have forgotten. This is my property, my house, my choice. I looked at Morrison, then at the crowd, then at Detective Vasquez standing in my doorway. And I choose neither. What? Morrison stepped forward. Mrs. Allen, you can't. I choose transparency with wisdom. I choose a middle path. I addressed the crowd. I will work with historians, ethicists, and legal experts to review everything in that vault. Documents that pose genuine security risks stay classified. Documents that reveal historical wrongdoing get released through proper channels. And most importantly, I maintain control of the process. The government will never agree to that, someone in the crowd shouted. Then the government can try to take the property from a 67-year-old widow through legal channels while the media watches every move. I turned to Morrison. Or you can work with me and maintain some control over the process. Your choice, Director. Morrison's face was stone. You're playing a dangerous game. No, I'm ending one. This game has been played for 3 generations, and it cost me my husband's honesty. It cost Eleanor Allen her freedom. It cost Ray Castillo his peace of mind. No more. I walked back into my house, still holding the keys. Behind me, I heard Morrison giving orders, the crowd beginning to argue, Vasquez trying to restore order. But I'd said what needed to be said. In my kitchen, Claire sat at the table, looking lost. Scott had been released pending formal charges, Vasquez's recommendation based on his cooperation and lack of prior record. He stood by the window, unable to meet my eyes. Mom, he said quietly, I'm so sorry. I know you are, but sorry doesn't undo what you did. I thought I was doing the right thing. Vanessa convinced me that you were being used, that Dad had been brainwashed by government propaganda. Your father made his choices consciously and deliberately. He wasn't perfect, and his choices weren't always right. But they weren't made out of ignorance or coercion. I sat down heavily. You, on the other hand, let yourself be manipulated because you wanted to feel important. Scott flinched, but he didn't deny it. What happens now? Claire asked. With the vault? With all of this? Now I do what your father should have done years ago. I face it honestly. The vault will be reviewed. Some secrets will come out, some will stay buried, and I'll make sure the decisions are made by people smarter than me. They'll fight you, Scott said. Both sides. The government and the new collective. They'll never let you maintain control. Then they'll have a fight on their hands. I looked at my children. Flawed, complicated, human. I'm a 67-year-old widow who buried a husband, raised a family, and maintained a property for 4 decades. I've survived worse than bureaucrats and idealists. Morrison appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Allen, we need to discuss terms. Then sit down, Director. We'll discuss them. I gestured to the table. But these are my terms, my house, my family's legacy. And for the first time in 3 generations, Allen is going to handle this honestly. As the sun set over my property, my home, my battleground, my inheritance, I realized something important. Thomas had protected me by keeping secrets. Scott had betrayed me by thinking he knew better. Claire had compromised me for money, but I was protecting myself by demanding truth, and that made all the difference. 3 months later, I stood in my kitchen making coffee as the morning sun streamed through windows I'd had professionally cleaned for the first time in years. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the exposure of its secrets had lifted a weight from the very walls. The negotiations with Director Morrison had taken 6 weeks. She'd brought lawyers, bureaucrats, and officials who spoke in carefully rehearsed paragraphs designed to intimidate. But I'd brought something more powerful: public attention, and a legal team funded by a coalition of historical societies and civil liberties organizations who'd rallied behind my cause. In the end, we'd reached a compromise that satisfied no one completely, which meant it was probably fair. A review committee had been established. Historians, ethicists, former intelligence officials, and legal experts, none of whom had ties to either the government's security apparatus or the new collective's ideology. They would spend the next 2 years examining every document in the vault, making recommendations about what should remain classified and what could be safely released. I maintained ownership of the property and final approval over the committee's recommendations. The government maintained security oversight and the right to appeal decisions they deemed dangerous. The new collective had been excluded entirely from the process, much to their vocal outrage. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that mattered. Detective Vasquez had closed the case with remarkable efficiency. Scott faced charges of conspiracy and assault, but his cooperation and genuine remorse had earned him a plea deal, probation, community service, and mandatory counseling. Vanessa, less fortunate, was serving 18 months in federal prison for her role as a recruiter for the new collective. Their marriage had ended quietly, dissolved by paperwork and mutual recognition that the foundation had been rotten from the start. The young man who'd led the attempt to kidnap me, his name was Marcus Brennan, and he'd been a graduate student radicalized by online communities, had received a harsher sentence. 3 years, with possibility of early release if he provided information about other new collective cells. Ray Castillo had recovered physically, though he'd told me during a visit last month that he still had nightmares about the tunnels. I'd written him a check for $20,000, money I couldn't really afford, but felt was the least I could do. He'd tried to refuse it, but I'd insisted. "You were traumatized because of secrets my family kept," I'd told him. "Let me do this one small thing to make it right." He'd accepted, tears in his eyes, and promised to use it for therapy and to help his mother with her medical bills. Good man, that Ray. I'd recommended his plumbing services to everyone I knew. Claire had moved back to Michigan after the first month. Our relationship remained strained, wounded by her betrayal even though I understood the desperation that had driven it. She called every Sunday, and we talked about safe things, her children, the weather, recipes. We didn't discuss the money she'd taken or the information she'd sold. Maybe someday we would, but not yet. Some wounds needed time. Scott visited twice a week, always alone, always contrite. He'd quit his job at the insurance company and was working construction now, physical labor that seemed to ground him in ways his previous work hadn't. He was rebuilding his life slowly, brick by brick, and I respected that. "I'm learning to work with my hands," he'd told me last week, showing me calluses with something like pride. Like Dad did. Maybe I should have started there. Maybe, I'd agreed. But you're starting now, and that counts for something. He'd hugged me then, and for the first time since the night of his betrayal, I'd hugged him back without reservation. The house itself had become something of a local curiosity. Tours weren't allowed, the vault remained highly restricted, but people drove by to see that place with the secret tunnels. The Millbrook Historical Society had asked repeatedly if they could install a plaque. I'd declined. Some history didn't need monuments. Frank Morrison, the county inspector, had been hired by the review committee to document the tunnel system comprehensively. He'd discovered 7 more tunnel branches, 2 additional chambers, and evidence that the network had been expanded as recently as the 1990s. Thomas had been busier than I'd known, maintaining and updating his family's legacy while keeping it all hidden from me. I'd found more of his letters during my own exploration of the house's hiding places. He'd been meticulous about documentation, leaving behind a detailed account of his activities as guardian. Reading them had been painful, seeing how much of his life he'd lived in secret, but also illuminating. One letter, dated a month before his cancer diagnosis, had brought me to tears. "Margaret is the strongest person I know, and I've failed her by keeping these secrets." I told myself I was protecting her, but really I was protecting myself from her judgment. She would have asked hard questions I couldn't answer. She would have demanded I choose between family and duty, and I wasn't brave enough to face that choice. If you're reading this, my love, know that every lie I told was wrapped around a truth. I loved you more than the secrets, even though I served the secrets better. Forgive me. I'd forgiven him. Not because the betrayal didn't hurt, but because I understood the impossible position he'd been in. The collective's guardianship had been passed down as both honor and burden, and Thomas had carried it the best way he knew how. But I was carrying it differently, openly, honestly. And that felt right. The brooch, Eleanor's brooch, with its 3 interlocked circles, sat in a safe deposit box now, along with Thomas's journal and the original documents from the vault. They were historical artifacts, and the review committee wanted them preserved. I'd kept copies of Thomas's letters, though. Those were mine. On a bright morning in early spring, I received an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 80s, elegant despite her age, arrived in a chauffeured car and introduced herself as Anna Blackwood. Eleanor Allen was my aunt, she explained over tea in my living room. I've been following the news about your property in the vault. I thought it was time we met. You knew about the collective? I knew my aunt had been involved in something she couldn't discuss. When she was committed to Riverside, my family was told she'd suffered a breakdown. But she wasn't insane. She was desperate to tell the truth. Anna pulled out an envelope, aged and yellowed. She smuggled this letter out of the hospital in 1963, 6 months before she stopped trying to convince anyone she was sane. She gave it to a nurse who promised to keep it until the time was right. The nurse gave it to me on her deathbed last year. I opened the letter with trembling hands. Eleanor's handwriting was spidery but legible. To whoever finds this, I am not mad, though they say I am. I tried to expose the collective because I believed the public deserved truth, but I was young and foolish, and I didn't understand the consequences. Some truths are weapons that destroy indiscriminately. By the time I understood this, my reputation was ruined, and my voice silenced. If you are reading this, perhaps you are wiser than I was. Guard the secrets that must be guarded. Expose the lies that must be challenged. And pray you have the wisdom to know the difference. I looked up at Anna, my eyes wet. She changed her mind. She did. But by then, no one would listen. She spent 12 years in that hospital trying to convince people she understood, that she supported the continued secrecy. They thought it was manipulation, another tactic. Anna's voice was soft. She died believing she'd failed everyone. She didn't fail. Her words, this letter, it's exactly what I needed to read. I hoped so. Mrs. Allen, what you're doing, the review committee, the careful balance, Eleanor would have approved. You're doing what she couldn't, finding the middle path. After Anna left, I sat in my living room for a long time, thinking about the weight of secrets and the courage of truth-telling. Eleanor had tried to expose everything and been silenced. Thomas had tried to hide everything and lived a divided life. I was trying something different. Honest evaluation, thoughtful disclosure, and the acceptance that some questions didn't have simple answers. That evening, I walked my property as the sun set over the fields. The police tape was long gone from the basement. The tunnels had been sealed at all but one entrance, which remained accessible only to authorized personnel from the review committee. My house had returned to being just a house, a home with history and scars, but no longer hiding dangerous secrets in its depths. I'd received offers to sell, generous offers from the government, from wealthy collectors interested in the property's historical significance, even from a movie producer who wanted to option my story. I'd declined them all. This was my home. Thomas and I had built a life here, raised children here, grown old here. The secrets beneath my feet didn't change the memories in these walls. They only complicated them, made them more human. At the edge of the property, where Thomas had planted apple trees 30 years ago, I found Scott sitting on the old stone wall. He stood when he saw me approaching. "I hope you don't mind," he said. "I just needed to be here." "I don't mind." We stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Mom," Scott said finally, "how do you forgive someone for what I did?" I considered the question carefully. You don't, not all at once. Forgiveness isn't an event, it's a process. You earn it back piece by piece, day by day, by being better than you were. Am I doing that? Being better? You're trying. That's the important part. He nodded, and I saw tears on his face. Dad would be ashamed of me. Your father would understand better than anyone the difficulty of living with secrets and the mistakes people make under pressure. He'd want you to learn from this, not be destroyed by it. Do you think the committee will find things that make Dad look bad? Things he did as a guardian? Probably. But they'll also find evidence of the good he did, the genuine security threats he helped prevent. Your father was complicated, Scott, like all of us. We walked back to the house together as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Claire called while I was making dinner, and for the first time in weeks, she asked about the vault and the review process. We talked for 40 minutes. Really talked? About difficult things. Progress. Slow and painful, but real. The review committee had its first public meeting the following week. I attended as both property owner and witness to the collective's history. Media cameras lined the courthouse steps, but I ignored them, walking inside with my head high. The committee chair, a retired federal judge named Amanda Torres, led the proceedings with firm efficiency. They'd already reviewed approximately 15% of the vault's contents and were ready to make their first recommendations. We've identified 3 categories of documents, Judge Torres explained to the assembled officials and press representatives. Category 1, materials that pose genuine current security risks and should remain classified. Category 2, historical documents that reveal past wrongdoing but no longer threaten national security. These will be released through appropriate channels. Category 3, materials requiring further analysis and debate. She looked directly at me. Mrs. Allen, as property owner, you have the right to review and approve these categorizations. I trust your judgment, Judge Torres. But I'd like to see the list of Category 2 documents, the ones you're recommending for release. She handed me a folder. I read through the contents, seeing references to programs with names like Operation Northwood, Project Artichoke, and Program Bluebird, documents about operations that had failed, methods that had been discontinued, history that was ugly but no longer dangerous. These should be released, I agreed. The public deserves to know these parts of their history. The decision made headlines. Some praised it as a victory for transparency. Others condemned it as reckless. Director Morrison issued a carefully worded statement expressing concerns about the precedent, but acknowledging the government's commitment to working with the review process. The new collective, predictably, declared it insufficient and promised continued agitation for full disclosure. Let them agitate. I was done being intimidated by ideologues on either side. 6 months after Ray Castillo's disappearance in my basement, I stood in the same basement helping to install a new water heater. The irony wasn't lost on me. The plumber, a different company this time, worked efficiently while I supervised. The storage room where the tunnel entrance had been was now properly sealed, the wall rebuilt and painted. You'd never know there had been an opening there unless you looked very carefully at the subtle difference in paint texture. But I knew. I would always know. That evening, I hosted my first dinner party since everything had happened. Claire had driven down from Michigan with her husband and children. Scott came alone but smiling. Ray Castillo came with his mother, who hugged me fiercely and thanked me again for my generosity. Detective Vasquez stopped by after her shift, bringing wine and stories from other cases. We ate in my dining room, the same room where Thomas and I had celebrated anniversaries and holidays. We talked about everything except tunnels and vaults and conspiracies. We talked about life, real, ordinary, beautiful life. After everyone left, I stood on my porch looking out at the property, the house behind me, the fields before me, the tunnels beneath my feet, all part of my inheritance now, understood and accepted. I thought about Eleanor, driven mad by secrets she tried to expose. I thought about Thomas, living a divided life to protect me. I thought about Scott, nearly destroyed by his desire to feel important. And I thought about myself, a 67-year-old widow who'd survived betrayal, danger, and the revelation that her entire marriage had been built partly on lies. I was still standing, still here, still strong. The house behind me wasn't just a repository of secrets anymore. It was a home where honest conversations happened, where mistakes were acknowledged, where forgiveness was a process rather than a proclamation. The phone rang inside. Judge Torres probably, with an update on the committee's progress. Or maybe Director Morrison with another attempt to negotiate terms. Or perhaps Claire, calling to say goodnight to her mother. I went inside to answer it, closing the door firmly behind me. My door, my house, my life, and for the first time in 43 years, there were no secrets hiding in the walls. Just memories, complicated and human and real, just as it should be. Now tell me, what would you have done if you were in my place? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out the video on your screen right now. I'm sure it will surprise you.